The autumn equinox horoscope is always located in Virgo. Planetary symbols of this horoscope from the long zodiac are as follows. The second third of Virgo, which is represented by the female figure that follows Virgo immediately, contains auxiliary planetary symbols from the secondary horoscope. The figure of the young woman differs from other 10-degree figures from this zodiac to a great extent. This figure includes the planetary symbols of the secondary autumn equinox horoscope. Firstly, it has a leonine head. We already know this to symbolize Venus in Egyptian zodiacs, so the planet referred to here is most likely to be Venus. Venus is nearly always present in secondary horoscopes because of its permanent proximity to the Sun. Secondly, we see a crescent over the young woman's leonine head, which means that the moon was visible near this location on the day of the autumn equinox. The moon may have been very close to Venus, since their respective symbols, the crescent and the leonine head, are in close conjunction. Another possible interpretation could be that the crescent in question is a symbol of Saturn. However, in the present case we have to reject this version, since it contradicts the position of Saturn in the primary horoscope. Furthermore, there is a solar bird over the shoulder of the same young woman. This bird makes the appearance of flying along the entire zodiac, marking the noteworthy places on the ecliptic by stops. There are no other auxiliary symbols in this segment of the long zodiac. In particular, there are no symbols of Mercury anywhere in the vicinity of Virgo. A small part of the zodiac between Leo and Virgo is destroyed, but according to the rest that remained intact, the only symbol from that area is that of the new year, a woman on a stool with an infant standing on her hand. Since we don't find Mercury here, it is most likely to have been invisible that day. Otherwise, as a planet that is never too far away from the Sun, it would have been part of the secondary horoscope. We come up with the following interpretation of this secondary zodiac as a result. On the day of autumn equinox, one could see Venus and the Moon in Virgo, close to the Sun. Mercury is most likely to have been invisible. There were no other planets visible in or near Virgo on that day. The winter solstice horoscope from the long zodiac proved to be rather rich in content. The figure of Sagittarius, which is the constellation where we find the Sun on the day of winter solstice in every Egyptian zodiac, is drawn as a special astronomical hieroglyph of winter solstice in the long zodiac. Such hieroglyphs integrate the constellation figure, Sagittarius in this case, with the symbols of the Sun, Venus and Mercury. However, such astronomical hieroglyphs are useless for the purposes of dating, since they are standard drawings which we find to be more or less similar from zodiac to zodiac. They carry no specific information that could characterize the astronomical ambience of a given year, and are therefore trivial. However, in the long zodiac, one finds other drawings of secondary horoscopes planets. This time, they provide us with valuable information that facilitates astronomical dating. Let us first study the part of the long zodiac that lies to the left of the Sagittarius hieroglyph. We shall disregard the symbolic scene with the slaughter of a calf, which also relates to the winter solstice point. It is followed by the figure of a young woman that symbolizes the first 10 degrees of Capricorn. We see a solar bird with a crescent on its head over the shoulder of this young woman. We already recognize this sign as one that marks the points of the solar itinerary upon the ecliptic that its author considered the most important, secondary horoscopes included. Thus, we are likely to find planetary symbols related to the secondary horoscope of winter solstice here, since we are still located in the vicinity of this secondary horoscope. Indeed, immediately after the 10-degree figure of a young woman, at the very edge of the zodiacal strip, we see a woman with a planetary rod in her hand. She rests it right upon the figure of Capricorn. We already demonstrated that the young woman in question isn't a 10-degree symbol in the long zodiac. The fact that she holds a planetary rod clearly implies a planetary identity, and the female gender of the figure can only refer to Venus. She does not belong in the primary horoscope since it is complemented with a transposition symbol. The rod rests on Capricorn. Thus, Venus was in Capricorn on the day of the winter solstice. The solar bird that stops over the figure of Capricorn has horns which look like a crescent. The crescent-shaped horns may be a reference to the moon in a secondary horoscope. However, in the present case, the crescent may also symbolize Saturn. Bear in mind that Saturn was in Capricorn in the primary horoscope, and therefore, most likely to have been in the same constellation on the winter solstice day of the same year. Saturn moves very slowly and remains in the same zodiacal constellation for several years in a row. The implication is that Saturn may have been reflected in the secondary horoscope of winter solstice, being in Capricorn, a constellation adjacent to Sagittarius. However, this is unnecessary from the astronomical point of view, since the position of Saturn in the primary horoscope defines the planet's position for the rest of the year as well. Nevertheless, if Saturn is indicated in the secondary horoscope of winter solstice separately, we just have a single candidate for it: the crescent-shaped horns on the head of the solar bird. Such horns symbolize Saturn in Egyptian horoscopes. Such horns are also an attribute of Saturn in the primary horoscope of the long zodiac. So, the horns on the head of the solar bird in this secondary horoscope may signify either Saturn or the crescent of the young moon, or both at the same time. Now let us study the other part of the long zodiac, one that lies to the right of Sagittarius. First, we see figures of two young women, the bordering 10-degree segments of Sagittarius and Scorpio. Then we see the scene with a wolf over a scythe and the solar bird nearby. Its meaning remains unknown to the authors. Next, we see the sign of the Scorpio constellation followed by a fantasy figure of a man with bovine legs and a cup in each hand. The authors couldn't gather much about its meaning, either. However, numerous figures with similar cups in their hands accompany planets in the secondary horoscopes of the lesser zodiac of Esna. It is possible that what we see is a planetary symbol from a secondary horoscope. Indeed, after the perfectly normal figure of a young woman that marks another 10 degrees of Scorpio, we see another young woman, the last 10-degree figure of Scorpio bordering with Libra. This one isn't quite normal, it has the head of a falcon. We already encountered this method of integrating a secondary horoscope's planetary symbol in the figure of a young woman that marks 10 degrees in the long zodiac. We see Venus marked like this in the secondary horoscope of the autumn equinox. Therefore, we must be seeing Mars here, since no other planet is represented by a falcon's head in the primary zodiac. The implication is that Mars was in Scorpio on the day of the spring equinox, most likely, in the part of the constellation that borders with Libra. Strictly speaking, this Martian figure may also refer to the secondary horoscope of the autumn equinox, since we see it almost exactly in the middle between Virgo and Sagittarius. The final version of the secondary winter solstice horoscope from the long zodiac is as follows. Venus and Saturn, possibly accompanied by the Moon, are in Capricorn. Mercury is near the Sun, which is in Sagittarius. However, Mercury's position isn't stated explicitly. Mars is in Scorpio, not far away from Libra. There were no other planets near the Sun. Should Mars prove absent, it will manifest in the same position during the autumn equinox. The spring equinox point in Pisces is marked with a rectangular plaque in the long zodiac of Dendera. The only candidate for a secondary horoscope planet in the vicinity of Pisces is the large circle containing a man who makes an offering, and that only if the circle in question isn't a figure from the primary horoscope. There are no other possible representations of secondary horoscope planets. All other figures are already called for. They either stand for primary horoscope planets or 10-degree figures. If the circle near Pisces bears relation to the secondary horoscope, it should naturally represent the Sun, since the latter would be altogether absent from the horoscope in question otherwise. This would render the secondary horoscope of spring equinox non-existent, since the central planet of any secondary horoscope is always the Sun, and it is always drawn in some manner. As for the male figure making an offering inside the circle, it may stand for some secondary horoscope planet in theory. However, the figure has no characteristics of any kind that would allow us to identify it as a planet without ambiguity. The only obvious thing is the male gender of the figure, which means it can be identified as any planet at all, excepting Venus. This secondary horoscope gives us no further data. The summer solstice horoscope that we find in the long zodiac of Dendera is rather noteworthy. The actual sign of Gemini as drawn in the long zodiac is an astronomical hieroglyph that combines the symbol of Gemini with those of Mercury and Venus. In other words, it comprises Gemini and a minimal horoscope of summer solstice. However, it is of no use for dating, since it remains the same from zodiac to zodiac. If we continue moving leftwards from Gemini, we shall see a young woman standing for the first 10-degree segment of Cancer, followed by the symbols of the summer solstice. The man in a boat with his hand raised in the air and a solar bird on top of a perch. The 10-degree female figure in Cancer, the one that follows Gemini immediately, is facing the opposite direction, which is the only such case in the entire long zodiac. All other 10-degree female figures face the same direction as the rest of the procession. The young woman is facing the opposite direction for a good reason. Had she failed to do so, the entire scene that we see to her left would have been behind her back, already in Cancer, that is. However, having made the figure face the opposite direction, the Egyptian artist also got her to face the scene on the left, thereby placing the scene in Gemini. Furthermore, as we shall see later, the entire row of figures that we see to the left of this young woman should be read in the direction opposite to the rest of the zodiac. In other words, a correct disposition of figures would require a reversal of their order, complete with the 10-degree figure of a young woman, so that the entire row should become superimposed over Gemini, possibly also crossing the border of Taurus. The 10-degree figure shall be facing the correct direction, and the figures on its left shall end up in Gemini and partially Taurus. The above made clear, let us attentively study the row of figures, starting with the reversed 10-degree female figure and ending with the edge of the zodiac. If we are to follow the zodiac from the edge and towards the young woman facing backwards, Taurus to Gemini, that is, considering the reversed order of figures in this segment, we shall first see two women standing in a boat. The one in front is holding a planetary rod, whereas the one in the back has a pitcher in each hand and pours water like Aquarius. The meaning of the scene is rather clear in general. The planetary rod held by the first female figure identifies it as a planet, which can only be Venus, since it is represented by a pair of female figures. The fact that both women are standing in a boat means that Venus bears no relation to the primary horoscope, having been transposed elsewhere. Furthermore, since we are considering the area that contains the secondary horoscope of summer solstice, this is where Venus should belong as well. Venus had therefore either been in Taurus or close nearby on the day of summer solstice, possibly in Gemini or in Aries, near the border of Taurus. The pitchers of water in the hand of the second female in the pair that represents Venus might refer to the fact that Venus passed the constellation of Aquarius recently. Indeed, in order to arrive in Taurus, Venus first had to pass the constellations of Aquarius, Pisces and Aries. The pair of women in a boat is followed by yet another boat that carries a calf. We are already familiar with this symbol of summer solstice. Next, we see the perch with the solar bird on top of it, another symbol of summer solstice. The last symbol in the row looks like a man in a boat with one hand raised high into the air. We encounter this symbol in many Egyptian zodiacs, and it always marks the summer solstice point. It is possible that this figure represents the sun during summer solstice, and so the figure was given a planetary rod. The boat underneath the figure prevents us from confusing it for a planetary figure from the primary horoscope. We come up with the following interpretation of the summer solstice horoscope in the long zodiac. Venus is in Taurus or close nearby. The position of Mercury isn't specified. Or, alternatively, the second Mercury relates to this secondary horoscope and its location is indicated between Taurus and Gemini. We see no other planets except for Venus and Mercury, which means that they weren't visible anywhere near the Sun that day. All previously obtained preliminary solutions were verified. Namely, the following was verified using an astronomical program. Exact correlation between the real, i.e., calculated positions of planets, as they are distributed along the zodiacal constellations, and the horoscope of the long zodiac in the chosen interpretation. Compliance to visibility indicators of Venus and Mercury. Venus must be visible, whereas Mercury is invisible in the position between Taurus and Aries and visible between Taurus and Gemini. These positions must be close to each other temporally, which is possible, due to the fast motion of Mercury. Planet luminosity at the specified moment and the depth of the Sun's submersion below the horizon for the moment the planet would rise or set, were accounted for. Correspondence to secondary horoscopes as described earlier and other auxiliary astronomical representations. One of the necessary requirements was that the symbolic description of every secondary horoscope contained in the long zodiac should correspond to the real celestial sphere for the year of the solution under study. Different possibilities for the beginning of a year were considered as well. The resulting exhaustive solution for the long zodiac was unique. April 22–26, 1168 AD. The discrepancy between this date and the early AD epoch when the Egyptologists consider the Temple of Dendera to have been built, is greater than a millennium. Later we shall see that the second zodiac found in the same Temple of Dendera contains a date that is very close to the present one, 1185 AD. The two dates are separated by a mere 17 years.